Welcome to my talk. This talk was supposed to be about the hidden biases of integrated assessment models, but in thinking about the talk, I've decided to expand it slightly to the hidden bias of using integrated assessment models in the first place. So this got me thinking about some of my historic experience doing modeling, which goes back 40 years. And also some of the newer developments, such as the recent report on the MAGIC project, which of course is an attempt to integrate issues across the energy, food, and water nexus. But there have been many similar attempts to do this kind of modeling in the past. Now, the integrated assessment models I'll focus mostly on in this talk are the ones that are relied on typically in the IPCC reports on climate change, and in particular, the models that are relied on primarily in the Working Group 3 report on mitigation of climate change. So those are the kinds of models that I'll refer to primarily. And as you may or may not know, there are typically 20 to 30 models that appear frequently in the mitigation literature. And that's, of course, particularly the economics of mitigation. But there are other models that appear in different universities and whatever. So primarily, the IPCC authors of Working Group 3 quote, from their own references from papers they themselves have published, and therefore many of the authors are addressing their own models and relying on them for establishing various scenarios that are discussed in the Working Group 3 report. Now, the one thing that occurred to me, as I say, based both on my own experience and thinking about the MAGIC report, is that I think one of the problems that we all face in trying to address complex issues like climate change mitigation, or more broadly, the food, energy, and water nexus, is that these issues are very complex. And so right away, being sophisticated academics or consultants, we try to address the full complexity altogether in one model. And we try to make a model that's as complex as we think the basics of the issues are. And so that leads us into models that are often greatly complex and have many substructures and sub-substructures and many assumptions and constraints and parameters that go into the models. But I think one of the problems is that we try typically to be too sophisticated, or we think it's doing more sophisticated science and presumably better science if these issues can all be sort of tied together and integrated into a single model, or at least single conceptual framework. But I think this is a serious fallacy, which I think has held up a lot of progress for policymakers, because I think, frankly, it sounds kind of silly to say, but frankly, the more complex the models we rely on are, the less likely policymakers could understand them, use them, or rely on them in their policymaking work. So I think this is, in fact, a serious problem. And so I think it relates to this myth that if we use more and more complex problems, this eliminates the need for scientific expertise and intervention in the analytical process. But I would argue in this talk, basically, that the more complex the models are, the more you need expertise, and the fewer and fewer people can possibly understand the models, and the fewer and fewer people in the world can possibly use them. And in general, policymakers don't have a clue as to what's going on in the models that they try to rely on. And I think this is true of the models that the IPCC Working Group 3 typically relies on. So I don't think most people that read the report, if anyone really does read the chapters on scenarios, does understand what's going on. And in fact, I would argue from the interactions that I've had personally with many of the model developers in the Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium, which contributes the majority of the literature in this field, that most of them don't know what their colleagues' models do and how they operate. They only have a vague sense of what the other models are structured like and how they can best be used in what they assume. So let's then go to the issue step by step of the hidden biases. So basically what I'm arguing is the biggest hidden bias in integrated assessment models is that by having integrated models that you're doing better policy development work than if you had separate models. So for example, a lot of my career was done doing least cost planning for electric utilities. And I used to argue that you certainly, even in a much more limited field like that, than looking at the whole energy system of the world to deal with climate change, even there you couldn't have a single model do least cost planning, even for a single utility in a single state within the United States. In general, I argued that you had to have a separate model to look at economic growth. You needed a separate model to project electric demand. You needed a separate model to look at how that demand might be modified by cost-effective energy conservation investments and practices, and that you needed then a separate model to dispatch the electric utility power plants in conjunction with the demand, and then you needed to put together the capital investments required for the least cost plans and see which plan is least cost and iterate among all 4 or 5 of these different models. So that just shows how complex even just electric utility planning can be for a single utility. And again, I argued that you could not combine these 4 or 5 different types of modeling efforts into one, that no one would understand what's going on, no one would know what's coming out of one model and going into another, and that it would be beyond the pale to begin to figure out how to update the models with more recent data if it was all one. And generally, policymakers would just not be able to get a feel for the separate issues that they might want to get a feel for, like how is electric demand growing, or how much do power plants cost, and why is a certain pattern of investments least cost and other patterns are not, et cetera. So even there, I felt that the best interface between these kinds of models was the human being, the policy analyst or the scientist that was trying to do this work to develop interesting alternative scenarios for policymakers. Okay. Now, getting back to the integrated assessment models typically used for climate change mitigation analysis, right away there's a problem, which is, and the first, you could say explicit bias, but it's not discussed, so in a sense it's a hidden bias, is that what we should be interested in is the least cost scenario over a very long time frame. Now, why should, for mitigating climate change, we put the sole emphasis on least cost? That's an issue. And the question is, how do we want to define cost? There are many different definitions of cost used in different models, and this fact alone is often hidden and not discussed. Sometimes cost is meant direct costs of technologies. Sometimes the cost is meant to be GDP changes, either increases in GDP or decreases. Sometimes there are more esoteric economic definitions of cost. Sometimes the costs include things that are not included in GDP, like externalities or economic or ecological damages. So there's many definitions of cost. So just the fact that all the models focus on some sort of cost minimization over a long time frame doesn't inform the policymakers as to what the basic underlying concept of cost is in the first place. The second problem that often comes up in these integrated assessment models is that the model structure is extremely complex to begin with. So often there's a simple rendition of a macroeconomic model connected with the whole energy system, which has hundreds of equations involved. And then there's the demand side that creates the demand for energy of various types, et cetera. So there's a very complex structure that's often not even presented in any detail in the model documentation or in the published literature documenting results from the model. So there's hundreds of papers looking at results from models and almost no papers that describe how the model was constructed in the first place and what's assumed. So structure hides, complex structures in general hide a lot of implicit assumptions that no one knows. Sometimes the model makers themselves aren't even aware of all these assumptions. And certainly the readers of published papers can't possibly be aware of them. So there's all these, hundreds of equations that are constructed based on historic data in part, and there's also never any discussion of the data and the sources and how the data is analyzed and what kind of statistical analysis is done of the data to get coefficients of the equations in the model. Beyond that, so the structure of the model and the equations and their coefficients are not changeable based on any kind of scenarios that policymakers might want to run. Those are fixed. Okay. Then in addition to all the hundreds of equations in the models that are fixed and all the variables that are fixed, then of course there are lots of input coefficients that are dependent on the scenario you want to run. But often this is, again, not made clear to the user of the model. So there are dozens and dozens of input assumptions that numerical values are required for. An example, of course, a very simple example would be like the cost of new electric generating power plants, a new coal plant, a new gas plant, a new nuclear plant, a new solar photovoltaic facility, or a new wind generator, et cetera. Those, operating costs, the capital costs, these all have to be input for a scenario. Now, again, one of the problems in many published papers is these key input assumptions, which really do have a large impact on determining the results of the scenario, again, are never listed in these published papers. In fact, sometimes it's almost impossible to find the numerical assumptions even in the documentation that supposedly exists on the websites of the modeling groups around the world. Some modeling groups make these assumptions somewhat clear. Some have no source that the interested reader could possibly track down. But again, say on the cost of nuclear plants, some models produce a lot of nuclear-based electricity in the future to deal with climate change. Well, no one discusses what a reasonable capital cost would be for a new nuclear plant versus what other models use. So you'll always find a wide range of these assumptions, and different modeling groups will use completely different sets of assumptions for key variables, like the cost of power plants, or the cost of new electric vehicles, or you name it. There'll be completely different sets of input assumptions. And yet, amusingly, in many papers, you'll see lines drawn on a single graph of the results of the, say, the energy mix from many different models for what they considered the same scenario. And yet, what they call the same scenario is really quite different, because if the scenario has different input assumptions, then it's not the same scenario. So often when you read a paper and they say, oh, we're comparing the output of different models using the same scenario assumptions, all they mean is perhaps the population growth rate and the GDP growth rate are the same, but there are hundreds of other assumptions that differ between the models. So these are all hidden biases as to which models you look at and for what purpose. You have no idea how to evaluate the situation. Now, one of the most important input assumptions to any model, and this can be varied from scenario to scenario, but often is not, is the discount rate. The discount rate, of course, is essential for the process of establishing what a minimum discounted cost is over a long period of time, which is the basic objective function that the entire modeling effort relies on. And you may or may not know that through the last IPCC assessment, the fifth assessment, which was published in 2014, all the modeling groups seem to agree on the use of a 5% real discount rate, which of course even then was very high. Most of us only wish we could get that kind of return on investment. And of course the discount rate in theory is, well, from one point of view anyway, is dependent on returns on investment, although that's not the only basis for one. Now, many environmental theorists and organizations and environmental economists argue that a discount rate from an environmental perspective should be much, much smaller, perhaps even 0% real, but certainly not more than 1 or 2% real. Remember the famous debate that occurred around discount rates in the 2006 Stern report, and this was discussed in the economics literature, particularly by Nordhaus from Yale. At any rate, in the IPCC reports and in most of the literature, the discount rate is never mentioned. If it is, it's often just in a footnote that would be very easy to miss. And the basis for why all these modeling groups should agree on using 5% or any other percentage discount rate is, again, usually never discussed. And it's certainly not discussed as to why it shouldn't be 0 or 1%. And there's often never, or basically never, a sensitivity analysis done to show the reader how the results of any given scenario would dramatically differ, which it would dramatically differ if the discount rate was changed. If only that single number changed in these complex models, the results would be often dramatically different. Now, this debate came up a bit in the special report on 1.5 degree scenarios that the IPCC published in 2018. And they actually did include some scenarios, 1 or 2, with lower discount rates. And again, the results were very different. In part, as you may know, a higher discount rate tends to mean that you'll put off key mitigation investments farther into the future because they appear then to be cheaper in discounted dollars, whereas a low discount rate would encourage society and policymakers to invest more in mitigation in the near term, which in fact seems like a good idea given what's happening with the actual impact of climate change on the world. So the discount rate is critical, and that's certainly a hidden bias because the number you choose is definitely indicates a bias in terms of whether you have a philosophy that investment can wait for a long time before mitigation is achieved, or whether we should invest more in mitigation in the near term. And then finally, one of the other hidden biases in many of the integrated assessment models is that none of the modeling groups seem to have agreed on the full range of types of cost or cost for different kinds of things that should be included in the model. What I mean in terms of cost of different kinds of things is, for example, the cost of energy efficiency, which of course is crucial and very important in terms of any policy to mitigate climate change. The costs of energy efficiency are not included in any model, as far as I can remember, and certainly not most. You may find that shocking, but true. So the costs of the supply side, say, of producing electricity, like a power plant, are included, but the costs of saving energy are not included, and therefore there's no optimization to look at how much energy efficiency investment would be least cost compared to building new power plants or switching from existing power plants to wind farms or whatever. So often energy efficiency is just assumed to be an exogenous input into these models, you know, at 1% a year or 2% a year or whatever. So that's a major flaw just to begin with in terms of both the substance, but it's a hidden bias because the model developers are not allowing efficiency to compete with supply side investments. Now, other kinds of costs that are often not included in these models are the costs of mass transit to replace private vehicles, or mass transit to replace trucking or shipping. Sometimes hydrogen fuel power plants are not included in these models, and sometimes they are. And sometimes putting solar panels on roofs, the cost of doing that is not included, as well as putting solar panels into large solar farms. And so you can go on and naming different options for mitigating climate change that appear differently in different models, and in many models they're neglected entirely. So when people talk about getting a least cost solution to deal with climate change, and a least cost solution to meet either a 1.5 degree increase scenario or a 2 degree increase scenario, often the different models are comparing different sets of costs in the first place. And finally, of course, most of the models don't include damage costs that appear outside of the GDP, like damages to human beings, damages to the plants and animals of the world, to the ecological systems, etc. So that damage costs from climate change in different scenarios are also not included in most models. Now, one other thing that's very important is that the time frame that's assumed that these models will run over is also another critical assumption that represents a hidden bias. So if you're constructing a model, as most of them do now, to run from the current base year, say 2015 or 2020, out to 2100, and you specify the temperature target for 2100, you're going to get a very different kind of solution or scenario, no matter how you base your criteria for what a good scenario is, than if you just had a model that ran from the present day 2020 to 2040 or 2050, by when we believe now the net greenhouse gas emissions should equal 0. So it's not clear anymore why people are running models from 2050 to 2100 if we really need to have the world respond in the next 10 to 20 years, get off on the right foot, get mitigation going strongly in the right direction. What is the model? How is a model running to 2100 going to help us? I would generally argue that they don't. In fact, they create other issues, such as the potential need for carbon reduction technologies, or CCS, carbon sequestration technologies, that really are not useful to think about in the next 10 to 20 years. So another hidden bias is definitely the time frame for which the model is constructed, and therefore the time frame over which it's run. So this gives you some sense of the host of issues that arise, even without dealing with a lot of the details of the different technologies and how they're modeled, etc. Another issue that comes up is that some of the constraints I mentioned earlier that are buried in the model that no one is aware of and that don't change from scenario to scenario, things like how fast the modeler thinks that new wind investments could be introduced in a certain region. Well, they don't discuss this as an assumption. It's never mentioned. But sometimes when models are run for a certain scenario, particularly a scenario like a 1.5 degree scenario with a lower temperature target, some models just say, well, our model can't even achieve that. We can't run, it's non-feasible. And they make it sound like, well, because their model can't achieve it, it's not feasible to only reach a 1.5 degree increase goal without exceeding that. But of course, the reverse is true. It's certainly possible to keep the temperature to 1.5 degrees. It's very difficult, but the fact that their model can or can't achieve that solution, given the way the model is structured, has no relevance as to the real world situation as to whether that target could or couldn't be achieved. So yet the literature makes it sound like, well, there's all these models that can't achieve certain targets, therefore it casts aspersions on the reality of the target in the first place, which is, again, another hidden bias. So to wrap up, I think we can see that the overall problem, I think, with integrated assessment models is they're too complex. They try to do too much, even in just the realm of mitigating climate change and mitigating the emissions of greenhouse gases. Forget connections with land use, food supply, and water. Because the models are too complex, they, I think, tend to mystify the issues more than help people understand the issues. And I think this certainly leads to problems in dealing with policymakers, because one of my complaints about IPCC mitigation reports is that they don't clearly state on about 2 or 3 pages, which is all it would take, how we can mitigate 90% of greenhouse gases with quite simple technologies. And it's pretty obvious at this point what we have to do in the next 20 years. But by running a model for the next 80 years, it obscures what we need to do for the next 10 or 20. And so sometimes I would propose just using some pieces of paper and using some graph paper and drawing some straight lines or simple curved lines on the graph paper and say, for this technology, this is how fast we have to implement the changes. So like for electric vehicles, we could draw a straight line on the graph from now, let it hit 0 in 2035 and say, from the level of private vehicles that are fossil driven now to the time where all new electric vehicles should come into the mix, and all new vehicles should be electric, we can draw a straight line and go from where we are now to 0, and you don't need a model to tell you that that straight line might be perfectly reasonable, but there are, assumptions that have to be discussed, of course, if you draw a straight line on a piece of graph paper, but it's a lot simpler discussion than looking at what a model is doing to the penetration of electric vehicles, if it even has electric vehicles in the mix at all. So with that, I will stop, and I'll be happy to hear your concerns about whether I've exaggerated the problems with making complex models usable for policymakers or even for technical analysts. Thank you.